Hi there, my name is Jessie Bond. I am the city manager for the city of Mercer Island, and I am joined today for this recording by Elaine Summergren, the Deputy Director of Public Works. We are recording an abbreviated presentation on June 22nd, 2022, specifically related to option 2 of the Parks Levy Renewal and Pioneer Park funding. Next slide, please. At the City Council meeting on June 21st, 2022, the City Council received a presentation on the 2022 Parks Levy Renewal. Staff did not have an opportunity to present all of the background slides on the levy renewal option, specifically option number 2, which again is related to Pioneer Park funding. And this was just given the length of the slide deck and other meeting constraints. So this presentation is being recorded on June 22nd, 2022, following that City Council meeting to provide all of the background information on option 2 and Pioneer Park, and also to include the accompanying staff narrative. We want to make sure this information in its entirety is available to the community and the City Council as they contemplate final action on a ballot measure ordinance in July 2022. Links to the City Council agenda materials from the June 21st, 2022 meeting and additional background information on the Parks Levy Renewal are available on the city's Let's Talk page, and the link is provided there at the bottom of your screen. At the City Council meeting on June 21st, staff was seeking direction from the City Council to place the Parks Levy Renewal ballot measure on the November 8th, 2022 ballot, which will be a full year ahead of the expiration of the current Parks Levy. The presentation included a change from the prior discussion on June 7th, a change of the Parks Levy length to 16 years. The current Parks Levy is 15 years, and this was discussed at the prior City Council meeting. Important to note that should the levy pass in November, City Council action will be required to end the current levy 1 year early. The June 21st City Council presentation covered 3 broad categories of the Parks Levy Renewal. The first is the base Parks Levy, which proposes to maintain the current Parks Levy amounts and all of the current levy categories. The 2023 proposed base levy amount is $989,000 and $989,923, and includes a 1% annual increase compared to the 2022 Parks Levy. Also discussed at the June 21st meeting was option 1, which proposes additional capital funding for ongoing playground replacements, and option 2, which is the purpose of this recording and presentation, which proposes to increase the annual capital funding for Pioneer Park to fund the restoration projects identified in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan. Next slide, please. As I've already noted, we did not have the time or the opportunity to go through this entire slide deck, which includes a number of important background slides on Pioneer Park. So we're recording this presentation today so that this information is available to the community and the City Council ahead of the July City Council meetings, when a final Parks Levy ordinance will be considered. Elaine, I'll turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you, Jessie. At this point, I would like to give some information about Pioneer Park's background and Engstrom open space, as well as information on the forest management plans that actually dictate what sort of work is being done in Pioneer Park currently. So Pioneer Park was originally acquired by the city in 1964. It was purchased from the University of Washington. The property is approximately 113.5 acres. In 1992, the Open Space Conservancy Trust Board, or Open Space Conservancy Trust, was created by ordinance in order to protect, maintain, and preserve Pioneer Park. In 2010, the city also acquired the Engstrom open space property, approximately 8.5 acres, that directly adjoins the northeast quadrant of Pioneer Park. And it is a contiguous forest. Since the city has acquired these properties, there have been many studies that have been undertaken on the forest, all different aspects of the forest health and just understanding the ecosystem. Those include different analyses, including studies of the tree canopy, of the soils in the park, and tree diseases, just to name a few. So here's a map just to show the layout of these two open space properties. So Pioneer Park and Engstrom open space, when taken together, equal 122 acres of forested open space. And this makes up just about 43% of the total open space acreage on Mercer Island. In 2003, the City Council adopted the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan. So this was a plan that was created by staff that provides the overarching priorities for the management of the park and specific direction about goals for the park. It also describes a lot of the health challenges that were being faced by Pioneer Park at the time, and really hones in on the need for active restoration work to take place in Pioneer Park. In 2008, the City Council authorized funding specifically to perform a full vegetation survey in Pioneer Park. And this was suggested to the City Council by the Open Space Conservancy Trust. The goals of this survey were to establish baseline information about the vegetation, very detailed information about the vegetation, to assess the effectiveness of restoration efforts that had been undertaken to date, and then also to create a detailed vegetation management plan that would guide the future work in the park. That plan and that survey were completed in late 2008. So I'll get into more details here about the Forest Health Survey and the recommendations made therein. So in 2008, staff established 56 permanent plots in Pioneer Park, and you can see them here noted in little yellow triangle or little yellow rectangles on the map. These permanent plots are 1/10 of an acre, and within each of those plots, staff collected very detailed information about all of the trees that were located there, all of the plant species that were found, information about the soils within those plots, and also information about downed and standing dead wood. The data was analyzed and compared to several other urban forests in the region, as well as wildland forests, just to get a better understanding of what the health was compared to those other types of forests. Based on the findings from all of this data that was collected, there were a number of recommendations that were made, but primarily there was a recommendation that was made to change the way that Pioneer Park was being managed so that the most pressing ecological issues could be addressed first and foremost. These recommendations that were part of the survey and forest health plan were adopted as an amendment to the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan and are included as an appendix. In the Forest Health Survey, there were several primary issues identified. And I would like to just run through those really quickly because I think they are very important to inform on the recommendations that were ultimately made for changing the way that the area was being actively restored. The first is that the data showed that there is very high invasive tree regeneration within Pioneer Park. And what this means is there are several invasive tree species that are coming in, young trees that are coming in at a very high density. These trees are ultimately the trees that will become the new forest canopy over time. I want to illustrate the density of the invasive trees that were found during that study. The primary invasive species that was found was English holly, and this is a common invasive in the Pacific Northwest. What the study found is that holly was regenerating approximately at 899 stems per acre. Now, jumping to the second bullet point here, looking at native tree regeneration, so especially our native conifers, the density of these regenerating trees was very low. So as opposed to this almost 900 trees per acre of invasive trees coming in, native trees were only coming in at 24 stems per acre. So you can see that over time, looking at how the forest would evolve and turn into a new canopy, that really the invasive trees were slated to become the new forest canopy. Also noted is that there was an increasing amount of invasive species cover in the forest understory. So although there were a lot of healthy and diverse native shrubs in the forest, there were also a lot of invasive species that were coming in and starting to outcompete those shrubs. So particularly notable are English ivy, another very common invasive in the Pacific Northwest, as well as Himalayan blackberry. The fourth point here is about the degradation of canopy trees, and there are a number of factors that point to the degradation of canopy trees. The first one is that staff had long recognized that there were issues with root rot and fungi in the park that were actually taking down full-size mature conifer trees. And so, recognizing that there was some canopy loss already from these native fungi, it became problematic to also see that English ivy was actually growing into these canopy trees also and could contribute to their mortality. So the reason that ivy growing up into these trees is problematic is that it adds a great deal of weight to these trees and can actually create wind sails that can take them down during wind events. So this was recognized as a really important point for future management of this forest. It became clear through the recognition of these primary issues that a new management strategy was needed to address these issues park-wide instead of on a very select basis, select geographic areas within the park, which is how restoration had been done until that time. So in terms of recommendations that came out of the Forest Health Survey, the first and really the central one was that there needed to be a task established that would help to return Pioneer Park to a native-dominated, diverse, and resilient forest. These were split into three different categories: short, medium, and long-term tasks. And I'll just point out that those terms can be a little misleading, because really this was about how this work is prioritized. So things that were identified as short-term priorities or short-term tasks are really the ones that need to be addressed first and foremost to really set the forest back on a healthy trajectory. For each of these tasks, benchmarks were set that would assign both a timeline and acreage goals for each of them to be accomplished over a 25-year period. So now I'd like to walk through the specifics of these tasks and really talk about their importance for the active management of Pioneer Park. So first up is the short-term tasks. And the short-term tasks are the ones that are really essential for addressing these significant detrimental effects that we're seeing on the health of Pioneer Park and would really set the tone for the future of the forest. You'll notice that all of these are actually tied to trees in the forest. And this isn't surprising. This is a forest after all. And this is the primary focus for managing this area. So the first one is treating those invasive tree species. I just talked about English holly and that it was really starting to dominate the forest. So getting in and really starting to get those trees out so that we could see native regeneration. The second is creating ivy survival rings. I talked about English ivy growing up into the canopy and starting to contribute to the mortality of these mature trees. You can see the picture here on the left, which illustrates this. Creating ivy survival rings involves cutting the ivy at the base of the trees so that the top section will die and will prevent new ivy from growing up these trees. And then the third is a very concerted planting effort. So planting native trees into the forest. And again, calling back to that very low native tree regeneration that was seen in 2008 during the survey, is really trying to get a very healthy cohort of young trees established in Pioneer Park. I'll point out that in this plan, there were 2 phases of planting that were called for. One, an immediate planting, and one later on, after several of the different restoration tasks had been started. Second, the medium-term tasks. So the medium-term tasks are really the ones that are critical for ultimately resetting the health of the understory. So this is looking down on the ground at some of the invasive species there. And these tasks are really essential for creating the type of quality habitat that wildlife relies on in this forest. So there are 2 tasks in the medium term. The first one is removing ground ivy and herbaceous invasive species. This is the English ivy and the Himalayan blackberry and a number of other invasive species that are actively outcompeting our native vegetation. This is a really big task, and this was acknowledged in the plan that this is why this became a medium-term task, because it was a very large effort. The second is monitoring sensitive areas within the park, as well as the park boundaries for new invasive species. So these are the areas where invasive species can become really problematic, have big impacts on the ecology of the park, but also can become the introduction points for new invasive species that can ultimately take over. And so being able to get out and monitor these areas to make sure there's no new invasive species coming in is important for the long-term health of the forest. And then, as I alluded to, in the long-term task, there's only one identified, and this is the second phase of tree planting that would ideally occur 20 to 30 or even longer years after the first phase of tree planting. Again, the plan calls for 2 phases of tree planting. The first phase of tree planting began in 2009. It continues today. And then just to note that the second planting is really about creating structural diversity within the park. So creating trees of different heights and different ages. And what this does is it really creates some resilience to the forest if the forest should face some sort of disturbance, like an insect or a disease coming in, or even a windstorm coming through and blowing down some trees. This can really help the forest bounce back after a disturbance. I do want to point out that the short, medium, and long-term tasks are really, like I said, essential for resetting this forest and really getting it back on to a really good footing as a healthy forest. However, I do want to point out that successful forest restoration work includes a combination of this initial treatment, but also a lot of maintenance. And so, this is really just to point out that once all of these tasks are completed, there will be a need for ongoing maintenance over the years. After all, this is an urban forest, and invasive species continue to be reintroduced to this forest, just as a product of people continuing to use it and tracking in some weeds on their boots. But really that the level of active restoration after these initial tasks are completed won't be nearly as high. This will be more of a periodic maintenance need. So moving on, I'd like to, before I go into the different options that were being proposed as part of the upcoming levy, is just to talk about adaptive management and how it fits into the Pioneer Park forest management. So adaptive management is really an important component of the Pioneer Park forest management plan. So what this strategy includes is that it ensures that the city's management practices are being really responsive to any changing conditions that we're seeing on the ground and any unforeseen challenges that we face in the park. And I'll give some examples. It also allows us to reflect the evolution of best management practices in the restoration industry. So if there is a more efficient way to do the type of work that we're trying to get done in Pioneer Park, this allows us to maybe just slightly change our practices so that we're doing things, you know, really up to the standards of the industry currently. And it is an industry that is evolving and getting better and more efficient over time. The third point here is that it allows us to use our resources as efficiently as possible to achieve our forest management goals. And I'll give some examples next. So since the adoption of the Forest Management Plan and the Forest Health Survey tasks, staff have made some changes to the restoration practices to respond to changing needs. I'll give some examples. Originally, when the plan was adopted, new plantings were not watered. At the time, it wasn't particularly necessary, and our new plantings were actually establishing pretty well. Found is that in the intervening years, we've had a fair amount of drought and some increased summer temperatures. And as a result, we've changed our practices so that new plantings are now watered at least for 1 year following planting. And this has really improved the survivorship of the saplings that are going into the park. A second example is that on the ground ivy and herbaceous weed removal task, the original plan called for just 1 year of follow-up maintenance and then going on to a 4-year maintenance cycle. What we found is that we actually have more long-term success with this task when we have 2 years of follow-up maintenance before we get onto the 4-year maintenance cycle. So I want to just, these are some illustrations of how adaptive management can actually help us improve both the success and the efficiency of the restoration work that we're taking on. I also want to point out that one of the things that we've had to adapt to over the years is that Engstrom open space was added to the purview of the Open Space Conservancy Trust in July 2010. The Open Space Conservancy Trust ultimately updated the forest management strategy and practices within Engstrom open space to align with those that are laid out for Pioneer Park. And this is just to really make sure that the way that this forest is being managed was really the same across the entire open space. And this makes a lot of sense because it's essentially the same forest, it faces the same challenges, and can really benefit from the same prioritization and active restoration. So again, with the addition of the Engstrom open space, the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan now covers the stewardship of 122 acres of forest on Mercer Island. So our progress to date on the Forest Health Plan. So with the funding from the current Parks Levy over the last 14 years, the city has made a lot of really, really good progress on the tasks outlined in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan. I want to call out a few of the specific tasks that have been accomplished over these 14 years. One of them is a really aggressive effort to address the holly and other weedy trees that have started to take over Pioneer, and Engstrom in 2008 and 2009. So since then, over 100 acres of holly and other invasive trees have been removed from the forest understory. And this has really helped reduce the competition for existing plants, but also opened up potential opportunities for native trees to regenerate in the forest. And again, this is one of those short-term tasks, very high priority tasks for the forest. The second is that ivy survival rings have been created on mature trees across 80 acres of the open space. again, one of the short-term tasks. And then additionally, in this first round of native tree planting, over 15,000 native trees and shrubs have been planted across 75 acres in Engstrom and Pioneer Park. And these are the trees that will ultimately replace the aging canopy and are really setting the stage for the future forest. Again, this is just the first phase of planting, and this is continuing today. So what still needs to be done in Pioneer Park? It's just a table that illustrates the numbers of what still is slated to be accomplished on the forest management plan. In terms of short-term tasks, there are two that still need to be completed. The first one is ivy ring creation on 20 acres across Pioneer and Engstrom. The second is some periodic invasive tree treatment and maintenance. So just making sure that those invasive trees that were eradicated or severely impacted during the initial round of removal aren't able to come back and reestablish. And this needs to happen across the entire open space. And I apologize, there is a typo on this slide. There is a third short term, which is the first phase of tree planting, and this still needs to occur across 25 acres of this open space. Apologies for the typo. There are two medium term tasks that are just getting started now. The first one is the ground ivy and herbaceous weed removal. This still needs to happen on 90 acres of the open space, as well as the monitoring of the sensitive and boundary areas for invasive species. This task has not yet begun and needs to be accomplished across 27 acres. And then finally, the long-term task, which is the second phase of tree planting. And this is slated to begin many years after the initial planting phase, and this will happen across the entire park. These remaining tasks are the body of work that was really used to inform the Parks Levy Renewal options that were developed for Pioneer Park. So now we'll jump into the Parks Levy Renewal options.
Thank you, Elaine. So for this part of the presentation, we're going to walk through the details of how the levy renewal options for Pioneer Park were developed. And what I want to point out before we dive into the numbers and the various options is that Pioneer Park has been supported historically by about $191,000 annually in funding. This includes a combination of capital funding from the Capital Improvement Fund and $77,000, which is derived from the current Parks levy. Going forward, we estimate to fund all of the work remaining in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan that an additional $400,000 annually is needed. And what I want to make sure I clarify here is that that's $400,000 in addition to the about $191,000 that's currently contributed, again, through the Parks Capital Improvement Fund and the current levy, or what we also call the base levy. So it's important to note that the assumption was made that those funding levels, again, that $191,000 will continue going forward, and that these options that we're presenting will add to that and provide a various number of opportunities to increase funding. Next slide, please. Elaine's going to go over these options in a little more detail in just a moment, but we have essentially 4 categories. Option 2A is catch-up funding to bring our capital investment up to where it was in 2009. And although we haven't talked about this in this presentation, in the full presentation on the Parks Levy Renewal, we mentioned that currently the Parks Levy includes about $77,000 in capital funding for Pioneer Park. That investment amount has been held flat over the last 14 years of the levy. So option 2A represents catch-up funding to address the inflation that has happened over the last 14 years. Option 2B and 2C are specific to funding, specifically option 2B, about half of the work remaining in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan, excluding the second phase of tree planting. Option 2C would fund all of the remaining work in the Forest Management Plan, except for the second phase of tree planting. And then option D would fund everything, including that second phase of tree planting. Next slide, please. So these are the funding categories that were presented to the City Council on June 21st. And again, we're talking about a 16-year proposed parks levy. The options 2A and 2D, I just briefly described, and Elaine is going to share a little bit more about them in just a minute. And that estimated annual increase in funding, those numbers represent where the parks levy would start in 2023. And I want to say it again, this funding proposes to increase the amount that is already allocated for Pioneer Park in the parks levy. Next slide. Back to you, Elaine.
Great, thank you, Jesse. So I'll go into a little more detail about the different levy renewal options for the Pioneer Park portion. So the first option, as Jesse mentioned, is option 2A. And what this would do is bring the funding level back up to the same level as it was in 2009. As Jesse just explained, that amount contributing to Pioneer Park was kept steady over the course of the levy. And this would essentially provide funding that would make up the balance of if that amount had increased over the last 14 years. The work that would be covered by a funding at this level would simply be continuation of short-term tasks. So the three tasks there identified are the invasive tree treatment, ivy ring creation, and that first phase of tree planting. The second option, which is option 2B, would provide funding for 50% of the remaining projects in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan, excluding the second phase of tree planting. So just to enumerate what would be covered by this funding level, it would fund the performance of ongoing management of invasive trees on 55 acres. It would remove ivy from the remaining 20 acres of trees that have not yet had ivy survival rings created, which would complete the initial removal stage. It would fund the planting of 25 acres of native trees, which would complete the initial phase of tree planting. And then it would also start to chip away at the very large task of the removing ivy and herbaceous weed task. And it would fund the removal of those weeds from 35 of the remaining 90 acres to be performed. In addition, it would also fund the monitoring of all of the sensitive and boundary areas, which are approximately 27 acres, another medium-term task. So I just want to point out a couple considerations about this particular option. By funding only 50% of the remaining work in the Pioneer Park Forest Management Plan, ultimately what this would do is stretch out the timeline for completing this body of work. And this makes the completion of this work less efficient simply because there's an increased need for maintenance over time when the work is stretched out. And this is because if tasks are performed on a certain piece of land, it can't simply be walked away from. It needs to be continuously maintained to make sure that then it doesn't begin to degrade again over time. So really protecting that investment of active restoration. And what that means is that over time, there is a cumulative increase in the restoration costs due to this ongoing maintenance. The third option is option 2C. And this funds 100% of the remaining projects in the management plan, excluding that second phase of planting. So this funds not only everything that's included in option 2B, but it also includes the ongoing management of invasive trees across the entire park, the ongoing maintenance of ivy rings across the entire park. In addition, it also funds the removal of ivy and other herbaceous weeds from all of the remaining 90 acres that are still in need of this work. It also includes the periodic maintenance of all of the invasive removal work that's part of those short-term and medium-term tasks. So this funding level actually is really noteworthy in that it accomplishes so much, and really the key pieces of the active restoration included in the forest management plan, that it would move Pioneer Park and Engstrom open space out of the active restoration phase. So really the big investment in invasive removal, and would actually move these open spaces into a maintenance phase where they just aren't needing quite the level of intensity maintenance efforts, and it becomes more periodic. And with that, we have significantly lower costs associated with maintenance than were previously needed. The last option, again, includes all of the tasks that are in 2C, but it also includes the second phase of tree planting, the sole long-term task. This second phase of tree planting is the one that ultimately provides this age and species diversity in the forest over time, and really creates that, that structural diversity that is ultimately important for wildlife habitat and also resilience in the face of disturbance. As I noted earlier, having a distinct, difference in time between the first planting and the second planting can actually be quite beneficial to the forest and to the creation of wildlife habitat, simply by having diversity in age. So I just want to point out that that there is more information, a lot of details in the agenda packet that was prepared for the City Council for the June 21st, 2022 packet. And this slideshow and other presentations can be found in that packet as well.
So just to recap, and thank you, Elaine, for going into great detail on options 2A through 2D. These various options were presented to the council at the June 21st meeting. The council discussed increasing the funding for Pioneer Park. And next slide, please. Ultimately, at the June 21st, 2022 City Council meeting, the council did via motion direct the staff to include option 2C, again, the Pioneer Park increase in funding in the Parks Levy Renewal Ordinance. And that is in preparation and anticipation of a November 8th, 2022 special election, again, for the Parks Levy Renewal. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, there were two other components of that recommendation, the base Parks Levy, and they also directed us to proceed with option 1D, which is specific to the playgrounds. We didn't cover that here. This was essentially just to go over the background slides on Pioneer Park. The staff is anticipating the first reading of the Parks Levy Renewal Ordinance will happen on July 5th. And the second reading and adoption will happen on July 19th. As we've already noted a couple of times, links to the City Council agenda materials from the June 21st, 2022 City Council meeting is available on the City Let's Talk page, and the link is included there at the bottom of the screen. That Let's Talk page also includes background information on the Parks Levy Renewal. That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.